Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the heavy velvet curtains on a time when sleep was less a gentle drift into dreamland and more a nightly battle against the restless, buzzing mind. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit Victorian bedroom, gaslight flickering, shadows dancing. You've had a long day. Perhaps you're a factory owner counting profits, a governess wrangling unruly children, or just a regular person trying to make sense of a rapidly changing world. But when you lay your head on the pillow, sleep refuses to come. Hours tick by, the silence amplifying every creak of the floorboards, every distant carriage rumble. Your thoughts race, your limbs twitch, and a cold dread settles in your stomach as dawn approaches, promising another day of exhaustion. You probably won't survive this sleepless night without resorting to something odd. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? Let's see who else is awake with us tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Victorian era. A time of incredible innovation, burgeoning cities, rigid social structures, and widespread sleeplessness. It wasn't just a few unlucky souls. It felt like an epidemic gripping society, from the smoggy streets of London to the quiet country estates. You see, as the 19th century wore on, life accelerated. Industrialization meant longer working hours for some, but also more noise, more pollution, and a fundamental shift in daily rhythms. Gaslight and later electricity extended the waking day, blurring the traditional boundary between work and rest. The pace of business quickened. Telegraph wires hummed with urgent messages, and newspapers delivered news from around the globe with unprecedented speed. For many, this felt less like progress and more like an assault on the nervous system. Victorians were acutely aware of this perceived crisis. Books, pamphlets, and newspaper articles lamented the rise of insomnia, offering countless theories on its causes and even more questionable remedies. The language they used often reveals their anxieties. Insomnia wasn't just trouble sleeping, it was wakefulness, sleeplessness, vigilance, or even agrepnia, a term borrowed from Greek medicine, suggesting a more serious, almost pathological state. They saw it as a modern affliction, a price paid for the advancements and complexities of their age. So, what did they blame? Well, you could take your pick from a lengthy list. Mental overstrain was a huge culprit. With more complex jobs, increased literacy, and a constant influx of information, or at least, a faster influx than before, the Victorian mind was seen as working overtime, even when the body was at rest. Think of the businessman constantly calculating figures, the scholar poring over dense texts, or the socialite navigating intricate etiquette rules. Their brains, it was believed, simply couldn't switch off. It's a bit like how you might feel after doom scrolling for an hour before bed. Your mind is buzzing, but instead of TikToks, they had, well, maybe particularly scandalous society gossip or the latest depressing report on factory conditions. Another major suspect was diet. Victorian eating habits could be robust. Rich, heavy meals, often consumed late in the evening, were thought to sit like lead in the stomach, interfering with peaceful slumber. Combine that with strong tea and coffee, which were becoming increasingly popular and affordable, and you had a recipe for wide-eyed nights. They believed the digestive system and the brain were intimately linked, and an unhappy gut meant an unhappy, restless mind. It makes sense, in a way, doesn't it? Though perhaps less so when you consider some of the things they then tried to eat to sleep, which we'll get to later. Lifestyle played a crucial role in their theories. Lack of fresh air was a common complaint, especially as cities grew denser and pollution worsened. Conversely, too much excitement or stimulation could also be blamed. Attending a late-night ball, reading a thrilling novel before bed, or engaging in passionate discussion were all seen as potential triggers for sleeplessness. Even seemingly innocent activities, if overdone, could disrupt the delicate balance required for sleep. Of course, the ubiquitous Victorian concept of nerves was central to the insomnia narrative. The era was obsessed with the nervous system, seeing it as a fragile network easily frayed by the stresses of modern life. Insomnia was often interpreted as a symptom of nervous debility, or the fashionable diagnosis of neurasthenia, a catch-all term for a host of symptoms including fatigue, anxiety, headache, and you guessed it, sleeplessness. This idea of nerves was so pervasive that it became a kind of cultural shorthand for the pressures of the age. You weren't just tired, your nerves were shattered. A mainstream historical fact here is that the late 19th century saw a significant increase in the publication of medical and self-help literature specifically addressing insomnia. Doctors, scientists, and lay advisors alike churned out books and articles offering advice, reflecting the scale of the perceived problem. You could find detailed discussions on the causes, from physical ailments like indigestion and poor circulation to moral failings like excessive worry, or even secret vices. A quirky tidbit is the belief that certain colors or room decorations could influence sleep. Some suggested that bedrooms painted in stimulating colors like red or furnished with busy patterns could keep the mind too active, while soothing greens or blues were recommended for promoting rest. Imagine choosing your bedroom wallpaper based on its soporific properties. It's a bit like modern advice on screen light, but with significantly more chintz. Historians still argue whether the Victorian insomnia epidemic was a genuine, measurable increase in sleeplessness compared to previous eras, or if it was more a consequence of heightened awareness, changing social norms around sleep length, and the medicalization of what might have previously been considered normal variations in sleep patterns. Was everyone really sleeping less, or were they just talking about it more and pathologizing it? It's hard to say definitively, but the belief in the epidemic was certainly real, fueling a desperate search for solutions. This desperation led to an explosion of remedies, some rooted in ancient practices, others products of burgeoning scientific understanding, and many simply flights of fancy or outright quackery. They tried everything, changing their diets, altering their environments, inventing machines, dabbling in early forms of psychology, and perhaps most famously, turning to substances that promised oblivion. The perceived causes were varied, complex, and often intertwined with the anxieties of a society grappling with rapid change. And the cures? Well, they were often even stranger. So, you're lying there, wide awake, your mind racing, your digestion potentially protesting that late, heavy supper of roast beef and suet pudding. The Victorians, remember, firmly believed that what you ate, especially before bed, was a major player in the sleeplessness game. And if rich food kept you awake, surely specific foods could put you to sleep? This led to some truly peculiar dietary prescriptions, far beyond just, maybe skip the third helping of spotted dick. Forget warm milk, that was probably too simple for the Victorian imagination when it came to battling a full-blown nervous debility. Instead, you might be advised to consume things that sound less like comfort food and more like a dare. One popular theory held that bland, easily digestible foods were best, but others swung in the opposite direction, suggesting that certain stimulating or even slightly intoxicating substances, taken in controlled doses, could lull the body into rest. Take alcohol, for instance. While we now know alcohol disrupts sleep cycles, Victorians often saw it as a legitimate soporific. A glass of port, a small amount of brandy, or even a specific nightcap liquor was a common recommendation. The logic was simple: it relaxed you, dulled the buzzing in your head, and hopefully knocked you out. Of course, the morning after might involve a throbbing headache that made you wish you'd stayed awake, but hey, you did sleep, right? This wasn't just folk wisdom. Some medical guides of the era cautiously endorsed small amounts of alcohol for this purpose, though they often warned against excess. It was a delicate balance, like trying to walk a tightrope made of trifle. Then there were the drinks that promised a gentler descent into slumber. Hot water was sometimes recommended, perhaps just for the soothing ritual, or maybe they believed it settled the stomach. Chamomile tea, a classic still used today, was around, but it rubbed shoulders with far stranger brews. How about a decoction of poppy heads? Yes, the same plant that gives us opium, boiled down into a tea. This was essentially a mild form of the much stronger stuff we'll discuss later, an attempt to harness its sedative properties in a supposedly less dangerous way. You were essentially brewing a weak opioid tea before hitting the sack. Sleepy time, indeed, but perhaps a bit too sleepy for some. Solid food recommendations were equally varied and often contradictory. While blandness was sometimes key, others advocated for foods believed to have specific soporific properties. Lettuce, as mentioned in the title, was a big one, thanks to its milky sap containing lacticarium, which we'll dedicate a whole section to later. But how about onions? Yes, eating raw onions before bed was occasionally suggested, based on the idea that their strong smell and taste had a calming effect on the nerves. Imagine the morning breath after that sleep cure. You might achieve solitude, which would certainly prevent late-night social engagements keeping you up, but actual sleep? Doubtful. Another fascinating, if slightly repulsive, suggestion involves certain animal products. Calves' foot jelly, a rather unappetizing Victorian dessert made by boiling down calves' feet, was surprisingly popular as a general tonic, and yes, a sleep aid. Rich in gelatin and protein, it was thought to be easily digestible and nourishing for the nervous system. You'd spoon down this wobbly, flavorless goo, hoping the sheer effort of keeping it down would tire you out enough to sleep. Sweet things were also sometimes recommended, based on the idea that they soothed the nerves or provided quick energy to a depleted system. A lump of sugar, a spoonful of honey, or even a small piece of cake might be taken before bed. This contrasts sharply with modern advice to avoid sugar before sleep, highlighting how fundamentally their understanding of digestion and sleep differed. A mainstream historical fact here is that the Victorian era saw the rise of commercially produced, invalid foods and tonics, many of which were marketed specifically for those suffering from digestive issues and sleeplessness. These often contain things like malt extract, protein supplements derived from meat, and various herbs, promising to nourish the body and calm the nerves, thereby restoring restful sleep. You could buy potions and powders off the shelf, adding another layer to the complex landscape of Victorian sleep remedies. A quirky tidbit involves the belief that the temperature of food or drink was crucial. While warm drinks were common, some physicians recommended cold foods, like ice cream or ice drinks, believing that the shock of cold to the stomach could somehow calm the system or redirect blood flow away from the busy brain. So, instead of a soothing warm milk, you might be told to down a glass of ice water or even try a scoop of ice cream. A rather jarring way to prepare for rest, if you asked me. Historians still argue whether the focus on diet was purely theoretical or based on any observed effects. Were people genuinely finding relief from these strange concoctions, perhaps due to placebo effect, or were they simply desperate enough to try anything? The lack of rigorous scientific testing meant that anecdotal evidence and prevailing medical theories, however flawed, often drove these dietary recommendations. The sheer variety of dietary advice underscores the trial-and-error nature of Victorian sleep medicine. There was no single consensus. What worked for one person, or was believed to work, might be the opposite of what was recommended for another. It was a culinary gamble every night, hoping that the calf's foot jelly or the raw onion would finally grant you passage to dreamland, rather than just indigestion and regret. And while some of these ideas, like chamomile, have stood the test of time, many others remain firmly in the realm of historical curiosities, a testament to the lengths people would go to catch a few Z's in an era defined by wakefulness. So, you've tried the calf's foot jelly, choked down the raw onion, maybe even had a glass of port, and you're still wide awake, staring at the ceiling as the gaslight gutters. The gentle dietary nudges didn't work. Your Victorian physician, or perhaps just the helpful chemist down the street, might then suggest something a little stronger. Something that promised not just drowsiness, but oblivion. Enter opium. Yes, opium. The milky sap from the poppy plant, Papaver somniferum. Today, we associate it with illicit drugs, addiction crises, and international crime syndicates. But in the Victorian era, it was remarkably commonplace, readily available, and widely accepted as a legitimate medicine for a vast array of ailments, with sleeplessness being right at the top of the list. It wasn't hidden away. It was on pharmacy shelves, in doctors' bags, and even sold in shops that today would be selling sweets or groceries. The most popular form for medicinal use, especially for things like pain and insomnia, was laudanum. This was essentially opium dissolved in alcohol, typically ethanol. It resulted in a dark, often bitter-tasting liquid that was potent and relatively stable. A few drops, a spoonful, depending on the concentration and the desired effect, and you were promised a swift journey to sleep. Why was it so popular? Because, unlike the hit-or-miss nature of dietary cures or hydrotherapy, opium worked. Its powerful sedative properties were undeniable. It dulled pain, quieted a cough, calmed anxiety, and crucially for the sleepless Victorian, it reliably induced a state of deep, heavy sleep. When you were desperate for rest, when your nerves felt completely shattered by the relentless pace of modern life, opium offered a seemingly foolproof escape hatch. It was the ultimate off switch for the buzzing Victorian mind. The accessibility was astonishing by modern standards. You didn't need a prescription for laudanum or many other opium preparations. You could walk into a chemist and buy a bottle, just like you'd buy cough syrup today. Patent medicines, those unregulated concoctions we'll discuss later, frequently contain significant amounts of opium, often without listing it explicitly on the label. This meant people were sometimes consuming opioids without even knowing it, simply seeking relief from a headache or a restless night. It was the era of pick-me-ups and soothing syrups that were, in reality, potent drug delivery systems. Imagine popping down to the corner store for some sweets and also picking up a bottle of powerful sedative, a quirky tidbit that highlights just how integrated opium was into daily life. Consumption crossed all social strata. The poor could afford it because it was often cheaper than gin or other forms of alcohol, and it provided relief from the miseries of poverty, including illness and exhaustion. The middle and upper classes used it for nervous complaints, headaches, and, of course, insomnia. Literary figures, artists, and intellectuals sometimes used it not just for sleep but also in the misguided belief that it enhanced creativity, though often at great personal cost. Think of Thomas de Quincey's famous Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Though that was about recreational use, the line between medicinal and recreational was often blurred. A mainstream historical fact is that Britain was one of the world's largest importers and consumers of opium during the 19th century, much of it coming from its colonies, particularly India. While a significant portion was re-exported, domestic consumption was substantial. Estimates suggest that in the latter half of the century, hundreds of thousands, potentially millions, of people in Britain regularly consumed opium in some form, often for medicinal purposes like insomnia. The scale of its use is hard to fully comprehend today. Of course, the Victorians weren't entirely oblivious to the potential downsides. Addiction, or opium dependency, as they might have termed it, was a known phenomenon. Overdose was a real risk, often accidental due to varying strengths of preparations and lack of clear dosing instructions. Yet, despite these dangers, its perceived benefits for conditions like insomnia often outweighed the risks in the minds of both patients and many medical practitioners. It was a calculated gamble, a trade-off between a night of guaranteed sleep, or at least stupor, and the potential for dependence. Doctors did prescribe opium and laudanum, often as a last resort when other methods failed. They might suggest specific dosages or formulations, sometimes trying to manage the risks, but the tools and understanding of addiction were primitive compared to modern medicine. The idea of a controlled substance as we know it simply didn't exist in the same way. The focus was often on alleviating the immediate symptom, the agonizing wakefulness, even if the long-term solution was problematic. Historians still argue whether the widespread availability and use of opium constituted a true addiction crisis on the scale we understand today, or if a larger proportion of users managed their consumption for legitimate medical needs without developing severe dependence. The lack of precise records and the difficulty in distinguishing between medicinal use, self-medication, and recreational use make it challenging to get a definitive picture of the true social cost. Was everyone who took laudanum for sleep an addict waiting to happen, or were many able to use it sparingly and responsibly by the standards of the time? It's a complex debate with no easy answers. Using opium for sleep, while effective in knocking you out, often came with unpleasant side effects. Nausea, constipation, confusion, and of course, the very real risk of developing a crippling dependence. The sleep induced by opiates isn't natural, restorative sleep. It suppresses REM sleep and alters sleep architecture. So, while you might get 8 hours of unconsciousness, you wouldn't necessarily wake up feeling refreshed. You might just wake up needing more. It was a short-term fix with potentially devastating long-term consequences. This reliance on such a powerful and dangerous substance highlights the depth of the Victorian struggle with insomnia. When eating raw onions or bathing in cold water didn't work, the call of the poppy was strong. It offered a guaranteed, albeit risky, respite from the torment of sleepless nights. But as awareness of the dangers grew, and as people sought gentler, less habit-forming alternatives, attention began to turn to other, less potent plant-based remedies. And one humble plant, already mentioned for its dietary properties, held a particular fascination: the lettuce. So, you've seen the powerful, pervasive, and potentially perilous path of opium. It offered a guaranteed escape from wakefulness, but at a cost that was becoming increasingly apparent to many. As reports of addiction and accidental overdoses mounted, and as the temperance movement gained steam, there was a growing desire for gentler alternatives. Something plant-based, perhaps, but without the heavy hand of the poppy. And surprisingly, many Victorians turned their hopeful eyes to a leafy green vegetable you might find in your salad bowl today: lettuce. Yes, lettuce. Not exactly the first thing that springs to mind when you think of powerful sedatives, is it? You probably associate it more with crunching sounds or the slightly disappointing base of a sad sandwich. But the Victorians saw more potential in this humble plant, particularly in its milky white sap. This sap, found most abundantly in the stem and base of mature lettuce, is called lacticarium. And to the Victorians, lacticarium was lettuce opium. The belief wasn't entirely unfounded. Lacticarium contains compounds called lactucin and lactocopicrin, which do have mild analgesic, pain-relieving, and sedative properties. Ancient physicians, including the famous Greek physician Dioscorides, had noted the soporific effects of lettuce centuries earlier. The Victorians, with their penchant for reviving classical ideas, often through a very specific, sometimes warped, lens, latched onto this. If opium came from poppy sap, and this lettuce had its own milky sap, well, it must be a milder version of the same thing, right? It was a kind of botanical logic that didn't quite hold up to modern chemistry, but it made sense in the context of their understanding. Lacticarium was sometimes collected and dried into a substance resembling opium, a brownish, gummy mass with a bitter taste. This was then prepared in various ways. You could take it directly, dissolve it in alcohol, creating a sort of lettuce laudanum, or even incorporate it into pills or lozenges. But the most common way to get your dose of lettuce opium was simply to eat the lettuce itself, often prepared in ways designed to maximize the extraction of the sap. Eating a large salad before bed was a common recommendation, especially using varieties of lettuce known to be particularly rich in sap, like wild lettuce, Lactuca virosa, which is significantly more potent than the cultivated varieties we eat today. Some suggested boiling the lettuce down into a kind of broth or tea, hoping to concentrate the soporific compounds. Imagine ending your day with a steaming mug of boiled lettuce water, hoping it would be your ticket to dreamland. It doesn't exactly scream cozy bedtime ritual, does it? More like punishment disguised as medicine. The appeal of lettuce opium was precisely its perceived gentleness compared to the real thing. It was seen as non-addictive, or at least far less so than poppy opium. It didn't carry the same social stigma or the same immediate risk of overdose. For those seeking a natural, mild sedative, lettuce seemed like the perfect solution. Doctors and pharmacists alike recommended it, often as a first step before resorting to stronger measures. It was the natural cure of its day, the equivalent of reaching for chamomile tea or a melatonin gummy now, but with significantly less scientific backing and a much less appealing flavor profile. You might escape the opium addiction, but you might just develop a strong aversion to salads. A mainstream historical fact about lacticarium is that it was listed in pharmacopoeias, official books detailing medicinal drugs, throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th, recognized as having sedative and analgesic properties. It wasn't just a folk remedy, it had a degree of official medical endorsement, appearing alongside far more potent substances. This shows how seriously it was taken within the medical community of the time, despite its relatively weak effects compared to what they thought it was. A quirky tidbit is that some proponents of lacticarium claimed it could produce mild euphoria or even vivid dreams, similar to opium but without the negative side effects. There were reports, often anecdotal or found in slightly sensationalized articles, of people experiencing pleasant, slightly altered states after consuming large quantities of lettuce preparations. Whether this was a genuine pharmacological effect, a placebo effect, or simply wishful thinking fueled by desperation and the desire for a safe high is debatable. Perhaps they just felt lightheaded from eating nothing but boiled lettuce all day. Historians still argue whether lacticarium had any significant clinical effect on Victorian insomnia, or if its perceived effectiveness was primarily due to the placebo effect, the general calming routine of preparing and consuming it, or simply the hope that it would work. While modern science confirms the presence of mildly sedative compounds, their concentration in typical preparations, especially from common cultivated lettuce, is generally considered too low to have a profound impact on severe insomnia. It might make you feel relaxed, or slightly drowsy, but it's unlikely to conquer the kind of nervous stability that kept Victorians wide awake for nights on end. Despite the questionable efficacy of lettuce opium compared to its potent namesake, its popularity highlights a key aspect of the Victorians' search for sleep, the desire for a natural, non-habit-forming remedy. It represented a move away from the dangerous allure of true opiates towards something perceived as wholesome and safe, grown in the garden rather than imported from distant lands. It was a hopeful, if ultimately rather weak, weapon in the battle against sleeplessness. So, you've crunched your way through a mountain of lettuce, sipped your boiled lettuce broth, and maybe even tried a lacticarium lozenge. Has it worked? Maybe you feel a little calmer, or maybe you just feel slightly nauseous and resigned to another night of tossing and turning. The quest for sleep must continue. If dietary approaches, even those involving mild opiates, from your vegetable patch, aren't enough, perhaps the answer lies not in what you consume, but in external forces acting upon you. Forces designed to soothe, to lull, to mechanically coax your restless body and mind into submission. Forces delivered by strange and wonderful contraptions. So, you've munched your way through the salad bowl, perhaps even brave enough to try the boiled lettuce broth, and still, sleep remains a distant, mocking concept. The internal remedies, whether dietary or herbaceous, haven't worked their magic. If you can't coax your mind and body into slumber from the inside, maybe you need a little external persuasion? This is where the Victorian era, with its burgeoning mechanical ingenuity and boundless optimism about technology solving everything, really started to get creative. Forget gentle rocking chairs. We're talking about purpose-built sleep machines, contraptions designed to physically manipulate you into unconsciousness. Imagine walking into a Victorian inventor's workshop, or perhaps a particularly forward-thinking doctor's consulting room. Amidst the bubbling beakers and anatomical charts, you might spot something truly strange, a bed frame fitted with elaborate springs and levers, or perhaps a chair with peculiar attachments. These weren't just quirky furniture pieces. They were dedicated sleep technology, born from the belief that rhythmic motion, vibration, or even targeted physical stimulation could override the pesky wakefulness of a troubled mind. One popular idea was the rocking bed. While babies are rocked to sleep, why shouldn't adults benefit from the same soothing motion? These weren't just simple cradles scaled up, some were quite complex. You might find beds suspended on springs or pivots, designed to sway gently and continuously. Some even incorporated clockwork mechanisms or weights to keep the rocking going for an extended period without human intervention. You'd climb into this mechanical cradle, hoping the steady back and forth motion would mimic the sensation of being rocked as an infant, lulling your stressed-out Victorian self into a state of blissful regression and eventual sleep. It sounds appealing in theory, doesn't it? a return to effortless, baby-like slumber. In practice, however, picture trying to sleep while your entire bed is constantly in motion. Perhaps less soothing, more like trying to nap on a particularly slow, slightly seasick train journey. Beyond rocking, some inventors focused on direct physical contact. If gentle touch could be soothing, surely a machine could automate that. This led to devices designed to simulate patting or stroking. One particularly memorable, and slightly unsettling, invention was a machine that would gently pat the user's head or back. Imagine strapping yourself into a device where a mechanical arm, perhaps padded with velvet or horsehair, delivered a steady, rhythmic pat, pat, pat against your skull or shoulder blade. The idea was that this monotonous physical stimulus would distract the racing mind and induce a hypnotic state conducive to sleep. It sounds less like a comforting lullaby and more like a mild form of percussive maintenance for your brain. Having trouble sleeping, dear? Just let the Head Patter 3000 work its magic. I can just picture the advertising posters now. Vibration was another avenue explored. Early forms of vibrating chairs and beds were developed, based on the, often misguided, belief that vibration could stimulate circulation, soothe nerves, or simply provide a distracting sensation that eased the transition to sleep. Some contraptions involved platforms that vibrated gently, while others incorporated vibrating elements directly into the mattress or headboard. You'd lay there, buzzing gently like a giant, restless insect, hoping the tremor would somehow shake you into sleep. It's a far cry from the weighted blankets and white noise machines of today, isn't it? Though, I suppose a constant low hum from a vibrating bed is a form of white noise, just a rather shaky one. A mainstream historical fact here is that these mechanical devices, while perhaps seeming fringe today, were part of a broader trend in Victorian medicine and therapy that embraced mechanical and electrical devices. The era saw the invention of various therapeutic machines, from early vibrators used for a range of ailments, including, notoriously, hysteria, to complex exercise machines. These sleep contraptions were a logical extension of this fascination with using mechanical force to address physical and nervous complaints. They reflected a faith in engineering and technology as tools for improving human health and well-being, even when the underlying medical principles were shaky. A quirky tidbit involves a specific invention patented in the late 19th century, a mechanical rocking apparatus for beds, that used a series of levers and weights, sometimes powered by a falling weight or even a small steam engine, to maintain a steady rocking motion throughout the night. The inventor claimed it was particularly effective for those suffering from nervous prostration and sleeplessness. The thought of a miniature steam engine chugging away at the foot of your bed all night, just to keep you rocking, adds a whole new layer of industrial absurdity to the quest for sleep. You might get to sleep, but you might also wake up covered in soot. Historians still argue whether these mechanical sleep contraptions had any genuine therapeutic effect beyond the placebo effect or the sheer exhaustion induced by trying to get comfortable on a vibrating, rocking, or patting machine. Were people actually lulled to sleep, or did they simply give up fighting the contraption and pass out from frustration? The lack of standardized designs, clinical trials, as we understand them, and reliable patient reporting makes it difficult to assess their true efficacy. It's likely that for most people, they were more of a novelty or a last resort than a reliable solution, perhaps offering temporary distraction rather than deep, restorative sleep. The experience of using one of these machines must have been interesting. Imagine the noise, the creaking of springs, the whirring of clockwork, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the head patter. Imagine the sheer awkwardness of trying to relax while being mechanically agitated. While the intention was to soothe, one can't help but suspect that for many, these contraptions were more likely to induce anxiety or simply annoy you into a state of resentful wakefulness. You've tried the mild plant sedative, the heavy food, the powerful opiate, and now you're being mechanically jiggled like a loose screw, all in the desperate hope of catching some zs. It speaks volumes about the desperation of the Victorian insomniac that they would subject themselves to such peculiar, often uncomfortable, mechanical interventions. But the physical attempts didn't stop at machines. Some Victorians believed that manipulating the body with water, in various forms, held the key to unlocking restful sleep. So, the rocking beds and head patting machines didn't quite deliver the peaceful slumber you craved. Maybe being mechanically jiggled isn't the most relaxing way to wind down after all. If technology isn't the answer, and neither is eating questionable foods or relying on powerful plant extracts, where else could the desperate insomniac turn? For many Victorians, the answer lay in one of the most fundamental elements: water. Hydrotherapy, the use of water in various forms for therapeutic purposes, wasn't a new idea. It had roots in ancient medicine. But the Victorian era saw a massive resurgence in its popularity, becoming a widely accepted, almost fashionable, treatment for a bewildering range of ailments, including, you guessed it, insomnia. Water cures were seen as natural, purifying, and invigorating. They offered a stark contrast to the chemical remedies becoming prevalent, appealing to those who preferred a more wholesome approach to health. The logic behind using water for sleeplessness varied. Some believed that manipulating the body's temperature with hot or cold water could influence blood flow, drawing it away from the overactive brain and towards the extremities, thus calming the mind. Others thought that the shock of cold water, or the soothing warmth of a prolonged bath, could directly impact the nervous system, either by stimulating it out of its restless state, or by gently lulling it into submission. It was seen as a way to reset the body's internal balance, washing away the stresses and anxieties that kept sleep at bay. One of the simplest and most common hydrotherapy techniques for insomnia was the warm bath. Sounds nice, right? A long soak in a tub of warm water, perhaps with some soothing herbs added, is still a popular way to relax before bed today. The Victorians certainly embraced this. A warm bath was thought to relax muscles, ease tension, and create a general sense of calm conducive to sleep. You'd sink into the hot water, letting the day's worries dissolve, hoping the heat would leach the tension from your limbs and the anxiety from your mind. Simple, relatively pleasant, and seemingly harmless. But Victorian hydrotherapy went far beyond just a nice warm soak. For more stubborn cases of insomnia, practitioners often recommended more extreme measures. Enter the cold bath. Submerging oneself in freezing water was believed to be incredibly invigorating and stimulating, often used for conditions like depression and fatigue. For insomnia, the logic was different. The shock of the cold was thought to produce a powerful reaction in the body, followed by a period of relaxation as the body warmed up. You'd plunge into icy water, gasp, shiver uncontrollably, and then, hopefully, emerge feeling somehow reset and ready for sleep. It sounds less like a cure and more like a form of self-punishment designed to make you too exhausted and traumatized to stay awake. Can't sleep? Try nearly freezing to death. Works wonders. Contrast baths were another variation, involving rapidly alternating between hot and cold water. The idea was that this rapid change in temperature would vigorously stimulate circulation and the nervous system, followed by a period of intense relaxation. You'd hop from a hot tub to a cold plunge pool, or vice versa, perhaps multiple times, hoping this aquatic roller coaster ride would somehow jolt your body into accepting sleep. It certainly sounds like it would distract you from your worries, if only by making you focus entirely on not getting hypothermia or heat stroke. Perhaps one of the most dramatic and frequently described hydrotherapy techniques for insomnia was the wet sheet pack, also known as the wet pack, or cold pack. This involved stripping down, often being wrapped tightly in a sheet that had been soaked in cold water, and then being covered with several layers of dry blankets or heavy quilts. The initial sensation would be intensely cold, even shocking. However, as your body heat warmed the wet sheet, it would eventually become a warm, steamy cocoon. The theory was that this process would first stimulate the skin and circulation, and then the prolonged warmth and pressure of the pack would induce relaxation and perspiration, drawing out impurities and calming the nervous system. You'd lie there, trussed up like a human burrito, feeling the cold gradually turn to warmth, hoping this enforced stillness and thermal shift would finally quiet your restless mind. Imagine the claustrophobia, though. Being unable to move, tightly swaddled in a cold, damp sheet, waiting for the heat to kick in. It makes a weighted blanket sound positively liberating. Douches or showers were also used, often delivered with considerable force and at varying temperatures. A strong jet of water directed at specific parts of the body, particularly the spine or head, was believed to have a powerful effect on the nervous system. Cold showers, especially, were prescribed for their bracing, stimulating effect, followed by the hope for relaxation. You'd stand under a cascade of icy water, enduring the shock, all for the promise of a good night's sleep. It's a bit like extreme morning showers, but done in the evening with a therapeutic goal. A mainstream historical fact here is that hydrotherapy became so popular that numerous hydropathic establishments, or water cures, sprang up across Britain and Europe during the Victorian era. These were essentially health resorts where patients would stay for weeks or months, undergoing a rigorous daily regimen of baths, packs, douches, and other water treatments, combined with strict diets and exercise. Wealthy Victorians flocked to these establishments, seeking cures for everything from indigestion and rheumatism to, you guessed it, chronic insomnia and nervous complaints. These places weren't just clinics. They were social hubs, offering a structured environment away from the stresses of daily life. A quirky tidbit involves the belief that the source of the water mattered. Mineral springs and natural spas were particularly prized, with the specific mineral content of the water believed to add extra therapeutic benefits. Taking the waters at a famous spa town like Bath or Buxton was not just a social activity. It was a genuine attempt to cure ailments through immersion and drinking the mineral-rich water. You weren't just getting wet, you were getting therapeutically wet, with water that had traveled through special, sleep-inducing rocks. Probably. Historians still argue whether the benefits of Victorian hydrotherapy for insomnia were primarily due to the physiological effects of the water itself, the placebo effect, the enforced rest and routine of staying at a hydropathic institution, or simply the sheer exhaustion induced by undergoing such rigorous and often uncomfortable treatments. While modern science acknowledges the relaxing effects of warm baths and the stimulating effects of cold, the more extreme Victorian practices like prolonged cold packs or forceful douches are viewed with skepticism regarding their specific efficacy for sleep, and some could even be dangerous. Were people truly cured by the water, or did they just get really, really tired of being wet? The sheer variety and intensity of Victorian water cures for insomnia highlight the lengths people would go to escape sleeplessness. From the soothing warm bath to the shocking cold plunge and the restrictive wet sheet pack, water was seen as a powerful tool to manipulate the body's systems and hopefully, finally, achieve rest. It was a physical battle waged with temperature and pressure, a hopeful attempt to drown out the restless buzzing of the Victorian mind. But what if physical manipulation wasn't enough? What if the problem lay deeper, in the very electrical currents of the body? So, the water cures, whether warm, cold, or wet-packed, proved insufficient to banish the sleepless demons. You've been rocked, patted, bathed, and wrapped, and you're still wide awake, perhaps now just slightly damp and exasperated. What's left when physical manipulation and chemical concoctions fail? The Victorians, ever optimistic about the power of modern marvels, had another trick up their sleeve. If the problem was rooted in those pesky, overtaxed nerves, those delicate electrical wires of the body, perhaps the solution lay in applying a little electricity itself? The Victorian era was utterly captivated by electricity. It was a mysterious, powerful force, capable of lighting cities, transmitting messages across continents via telegraph, and powering newfangled machines. Naturally, this wonder element was quickly eyed as a potential therapeutic agent for everything from paralysis to headaches, and yes, to stubborn insomnia. The thinking went something like this: if the nervous system was essentially an electrical network, maybe applying controlled electrical currents could somehow recharge depleted nerves, calm overstimulation, or simply reset the system, much like turning a faulty appliance off and on again. This led to the development and use of various forms of electrotherapy for sleeplessness. These weren't quite the defibrillators of today, thankfully, but rather devices designed to deliver milder, sometimes barely perceptible, electrical currents to the body. You might be seated in a special chair, holding electrodes connected to a buzzing machine, or perhaps electrodes would be applied directly to your head, spine, or limbs. The sensation could range from a gentle tingling or prickling to a more pronounced buzzing or even a mild shock, depending on the device and the practitioner's technique. One common method involved using a faradic current produced by an induction coil, which delivered intermittent pulses of electricity. This was often described as feeling like a rapid tapping or vibration. Electrodes might be placed on the temples, the neck, or along the spine, with the aim of stimulating or soothing the nerves in those areas. Another approach used galvanic current, a steady, continuous flow, which was thought to have a more calming effect. Imagine sitting patiently while someone held two metal pads against your head, feeling a constant, low-level current flowing through you, all in the hope that it would somehow convince your brain to switch off. It sounds less like a cure and more like a slightly uncomfortable science experiment you paid good money for. The theories behind why electricity would work for insomnia were often vague and based on the limited understanding of neurophysiology at the time. Some believed the current stimulated blood circulation, helping to clear the brain of impurities or excess blood flow that kept it active. Others thought it directly calmed the overexcited nerves, smoothing out the frayed edges caused by modern life stresses. Some even proposed that the mere sensation of the current, the distracting tingling or buzzing, was enough to divert the insomniac's attention away from their worries and towards the physical experience, thereby allowing sleep to creep in. It's a bit like trying to fall asleep during a minor earthquake. Maybe the distraction works, but it's not exactly a restful path to slumber. Electrotherapy wasn't just confined to doctors' offices or specialized clinics. As the technology became more accessible, smaller, portable devices were marketed for home use. You could buy handheld battery-powered units with electrodes attached, designed for self-administration. Instructions might tell you to apply the electrodes to your temples, your wrists, or even hold them in your hands while lying in bed. Imagine trying to fall asleep with a buzzing metal contraption clutched in your hand or stuck to your forehead. It adds a whole new level of complexity to the bedtime routine, doesn't it? Forget counting sheep. You're trying not to accidentally electrocute yourself. A mainstream historical fact here is that electrotherapy was a legitimate, though controversial, branch of medicine throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Numerous medical textbooks and journals discussed its applications for a wide range of conditions, including nervous disorders and insomnia. Prominent physicians experimented with different currents, dosages, and application sites, seeking to refine the technique. While many of these early applications were based on faulty understanding and proved ineffective or even harmful, the use of electricity for medical purposes laid some groundwork for modern electroconvulsive therapy, used for severe depression, not insomnia, and other forms of neuromodulation. A quirky tidbit involves the marketing of some of these home electrotherapy devices. They were often advertised with grand claims and illustrations showing people looking invigorated and happy after using the device, sometimes even implying it had magical, revitalizing properties beyond just curing ailments. Some ads featured elaborate diagrams of the nervous system being recharged by the electrical flow. You could buy electric belts, or electric brushes, that promise to improve health and cure sleeplessness simply by wearing them or brushing your hair with them, supposedly delivering a constant, mild current. The actual therapeutic effect of these passive devices was likely zero, but the power of suggestion and the public's fascination with electricity made them popular novelties. Imagine wearing a buzzing belt to bed, hoping it would lull you to sleep instead of just making your abdomen twitch. Historians still argue whether early electrotherapy for insomnia had any genuine physiological effect beyond the placebo effect or the temporary distraction provided by the sensation of the current. While some patients reported feeling better or sleeping more soundly after treatments, it's difficult to disentangle the influence of expectation, the therapeutic ritual, and the general care received from any specific effect of the electricity itself. Given the rudimentary understanding of brain function and the inconsistent application of treatments, it's likely that for most cases of chronic insomnia, these electrical zaps were more experimental novelty than effective cure, a testament to the desperate hope that technology could provide a quick fix for a complex problem. The use of electricity for sleep highlights the Victorian willingness to embrace new technologies and apply them to medical problems, even when the scientific basis was shaky. It was a bold, if often misguided, attempt to harness a powerful, mysterious force to combat a persistent and debilitating condition. You've tried eating your way to sleep, drowning your worries in water, and being mechanically agitated. Now you've added a bit of electrical buzzing to the mix. Still awake? Perhaps the problem isn't just physical. Perhaps it lies deeper, in the very workings of your mind, and the Victorians certainly had thoughts on how to wrestle control of that restless inner world. So you've been shocked, soaked, rocked, patted, and even tried to commune with the mild opium of a lettuce, and still, the Sandman remains stubbornly absent. The physical body, it seems, is not the only battlefield in this nightly war against wakefulness. Perhaps the problem isn't in your digestive system, your nervous wires, or the firmness of your mattress, but somewhere deeper, somewhere inside your own head. And the Victorians, ever introspective and often convinced that moral failing or lack of discipline played a role in ailments, certainly believed that insomnia was often a matter of the mind, a battleground where willpower and mental control were the key weapons. If you were a Victorian insomniac who had exhausted the external remedies, your doctor, or perhaps a popular self-help manual, might turn their attention to your internal landscape. The thinking was that the restless mind, the one constantly buzzing with anxieties, plans, or just random, unwelcome thoughts, was the primary culprit. Therefore, controlling that mind, bending it to your will, was the path to sleep. It sounds simple enough, doesn't it? Just decide to sleep. Why didn't you think of that before subjecting yourself to the wet sheet pack? This era saw a proliferation of self-help literature, often written by physicians, clergymen, or lay advisors, offering guidance on how to live a virtuous, productive, and crucially, restful life. Insomnia was frequently framed not just as a physical ailment, but as a symptom of a disordered mind, perhaps one plagued by excessive worry, ambition, or even secret guilt. To conquer sleeplessness, you first had to conquer your own thoughts and emotions. One common piece of advice was paradoxically to try not to sleep. This technique, sometimes called paradoxical intention, is still discussed today, albeit with more nuanced psychological understanding. The Victorian version was often presented with a stern, almost moralistic tone. If you were lying awake, frustrated and desperately trying to fall asleep, you were told to stop trying. Instead, actively try to stay awake. The idea was that the effort of trying to stay awake would somehow relieve the pressure and anxiety associated with trying to sleep, allowing sleep to arrive naturally when you stopped forcing it. Imagine lying there, wide-eyed, muttering to yourself, "Right, I am absolutely not going to sleep. I am going to stay awake all night. Definitely not sleeping." It feels a bit like being told not to think of a pink elephant. The very instruction makes the thing you're trying to avoid pop into your head. You'd probably just end up even more frustrated, but at least you were following doctor's orders, right? Another popular mental technique involved visualization or directing one's thoughts towards calming or monotonous subjects. Counting sheep, a classic still known today, has roots in this era, or perhaps even earlier, but it was certainly popularized in Victorian times. The rhythmic, repetitive action of counting was supposed to occupy the mind just enough to prevent it from racing into more stimulating territory, but not so much that it became engaging. Other suggestions included picturing calm scenes, like a tranquil landscape or a gently flowing river, or mentally reciting soothing poetry or prayers. You were supposed to create a peaceful mental environment, a kind of internal safe space, to counter the chaos of the sleepless mind. It's a bit like trying to paint a serene watercolor while someone is shouting stock market reports in your ear. But hey, you had to try. Controlling one's thoughts wasn't just about what you thought about, but also how you thought. Excessive rumination, dwelling on worries or past events, was seen as a major cause of sleeplessness. Self-help guides urged readers to cultivate mental discipline, to learn to switch off their worries when it was time for rest. This is where the connection to nerves and neurasthenia comes in again. The overtaxed, modern mind was believed to lose this ability to disengage, its mental machinery grinding away endlessly. Techniques like keeping a journal to empty the mind of worries before bed, or setting aside a specific worry time earlier in the day, were sometimes recommended. It was essentially an early form of cognitive behavioral therapy, though without the formal structure and evidence base we have today. You were your own therapist, armed with a pen and a stern resolve to not think about how you were going to pay the gas bill. The role of willpower was central to this approach. Insomnia was sometimes seen as a sign of a weak will, an inability to control one's own mental faculties. Therefore, overcoming it required a conscious effort, a determined application of mental strength. This could be particularly challenging for those genuinely suffering from severe anxiety or depression, where just deciding to stop worrying is far easier said than done. The pressure to simply will yourself to sleep must have added an extra layer of guilt and frustration for many insomniacs who felt they were failing not just at sleeping, but at being a disciplined, upstanding Victorian citizen. A mainstream historical fact here is that the Victorian era saw the rise of the mind cure movement and various forms of popular psychology that emphasized the power of positive thinking, mental control, and self-improvement to overcome physical and mental ailments. While not always directly tied to formal medicine, these ideas permeated self-help literature and influenced how people understood and attempted to treat conditions like insomnia. Figures like Samuel Smiles, author of the hugely influential book Self-Help, 1859, championed the idea that individual effort and discipline were key to success and well-being, a philosophy that easily extended to conquering physical and nervous complaints through mental fortitude. A quirky tidbit from this period involves specific instructions on how to lie in bed to facilitate sleep through mental relaxation. Some guides suggested adopting a completely relaxed posture, consciously loosening every muscle, starting from the toes and working your way up. You were supposed to imagine your body becoming heavy and sinking into the mattress, while simultaneously trying to keep your mind blank or focused only on soothing imagery. It sounds almost like an early form of progressive muscle relaxation combined with guided imagery, but delivered with the solemnity of a religious ritual. Imagine concentrating so hard on relaxing every single toe muscle, hoping it would somehow knock you out. The mental effort involved might have been counterproductive. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on willpower and mind control in Victorian insomnia cures was genuinely helpful for some individuals, perhaps by reducing anxiety about sleeplessness, or if it primarily served to blame the victim, adding psychological burden to an already distressing physical condition. While modern psychology recognizes the significant role of cognitive factors in insomnia, like worry about not sleeping, the Victorian approach often lacked the therapeutic support and understanding of underlying psychological issues that contemporary methods provide. Was it empowering self-help, or just another way to tell people their suffering was their own fault for not trying hard enough? It's a complex legacy. These psychological approaches, while sometimes incorporating elements that resonate with modern techniques, often placed an enormous burden on the individual. You were responsible for controlling your own restless mind, willing yourself to relax, and disciplining your thoughts. If you failed, it was seen less as a medical problem and more as a personal failing. It was a tough love approach to sleeplessness, relying on inner strength when all the external prodding, soaking, and buzzing had failed. But what if your mind was too far gone, too shattered by the stresses of the age? What if the problem wasn't just a matter of willpower, but a fundamental imbalance that required more than just self-talk? So, you've tried wrestling your mind into submission, commanding your thoughts like a stern Victorian headmaster, but that pesky inner monologue just won't quiet down. If controlling your thoughts didn't work, maybe the answer lay not in the quiet confines of your skull, but in the physical body itself? The Victorians, ever keen to find a physical explanation and solution for mental distress, certainly thought so. But when it came to exercise as a cure for insomnia, they were, shall we say, slightly confused. You see, the advice on exercise was wildly contradictory, a real therapeutic tightrope walk with no clear path. On one hand, a dominant theory held that physical activity was the key. The logic was simple. If your mind was overactive because you weren't tiring your body enough, the solution was obvious: exhaust yourself. Go for long, brisk walks, engage in vigorous sports, perform manual labor until you were physically spent. The belief was that a truly fatigued body would demand sleep, overriding the nervous energy that kept your mind racing. You couldn't possibly lie awake worrying about the stock market or the latest scandalous gossip if your limbs were aching and your muscles were screaming for rest, could you? This approach was particularly popular for men, especially those in sedentary intellectual professions. The businessman hunched over ledgers, the scholar buried in books, the writer penning lengthy novels. Their minds were working overtime, but their bodies were stagnant. The prescription? Get outside. Walk for miles in the fresh air, avoiding the city smog, if possible. Take up cycling, a new craze in the later Victorian era, or engage in sports like cricket, rowing, or hunting. It was seen as a way to balance the scales, to redirect that nervous energy into healthy physical channels. You were essentially trying to outrun your insomnia, hoping that physical depletion would lead to mental quietude. Imagine trying to achieve a state of calm exhaustion without modern athletic gear or recovery drinks, just sheer Victorian grit and maybe a slightly damp woolen running suit. Doctors and self-help gurus alike championed the benefits of muscular exercise for nervous complaints and sleeplessness. They described how it improved circulation, stimulated digestion, remember how important that was? And generally toned up the system, making the body a more hospitable place for sleep. A daily regimen of vigorous activity was often prescribed, sometimes even late in the day, with the idea that the fatigue would hit just as bedtime approached. Of course, modern sleep science tells us that intense exercise too close to bedtime can actually hinder sleep by raising body temperature and stimulating the nervous system, but the Victorians were working with a different rulebook. However, there was a powerful counterargument, rooted deeply in that pervasive Victorian concept of nerves and neurasthenia. If insomnia was a symptom of a depleted nervous system, frayed by the stresses of modern life, wouldn't vigorous exercise just make things worse? The opposing school of thought argued that strenuous activity further drained the already weakened nerves, exacerbating the condition. For these practitioners, often associated with the emerging field of neurology, the solution was the opposite of exercise, enforced rest. This led to the development of rest cures, famously and controversially associated with physician Silas Weir Mitchell, though variations existed elsewhere. For patients deemed to be suffering from severe neurasthenia and associated insomnia, the prescription was often complete or near complete bed rest, sometimes for weeks or even months. Exercise was forbidden or severely restricted. The goal was to prevent any activity, physical or mental, that could potentially spend the precious, limited nervous energy. Patients were often isolated, fed rich foods, and sometimes even discouraged from reading or engaging in stimulating conversation. You were essentially put into a state of suspended animation, hoping that absolute stillness and lack of stimulation would allow your shattered nerves to heal and, consequently, allow sleep to return. Imagine being told that the cure for your sleeplessness was to lie perfectly still in bed, doing absolutely nothing, day after day. For someone with a restless mind, that sounds less like a cure and more like a special kind of torture. This conflicting advice created a dilemma for the Victorian insomniac. Were you supposed to run yourself ragged or lie perfectly still? Was your insomnia a sign of needing more stimulation or less? The answer often depended on which doctor you consulted, what social class you belonged to. Rest cures were expensive and primarily for the wealthy, and what prevailing theory was currently in vogue. It reflected a fundamental uncertainty about the underlying causes of insomnia. Was it a problem of excess energy or deficiency? Of overstimulation or understimulation? A mainstream historical fact here is that the rest cure became a widely accepted, though often criticized, treatment for neurasthenia and other nervous disorders, including insomnia, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was a formalized therapeutic approach practiced by many physicians, not just an isolated quirky idea. Its popularity highlights the Victorian medical community's belief that many modern ailments were rooted in a depletion or overstimulation of the nervous system, requiring drastic measures to restore balance. A quirky tidbit involves the specific nature of the rest cure environment. Patients were often confined to a room with darkened windows, sometimes forbidden visitors, and even spoon-fed by nurses to prevent any exertion. The level of enforced passivity was extreme, designed to eliminate every possible source of stimulation or effort. It wasn't just, take it easy. It was, become a human vegetable under strict supervision. All in the name of restoring nervous health and sleep. It sounds like a particularly grim spa retreat, where the only activity is waiting for someone to bring you your next bowl of broth. Historians still argue whether the rest cure or the exercise cure had any genuine long-term benefit for Victorian insomniacs beyond the placebo effect or the temporary relief provided by a structured environment away from daily stress. While some patients undoubtedly improved, it's difficult to determine the specific role of the exercise or rest itself compared to other factors like diet, routine, or simply the natural fluctuation of their condition. Furthermore, the psychological impact of enforced rest, particularly the isolation and infantilization, is now widely criticized, suggesting that for many the cure might have been worse than the sleeplessness itself. Was the exhaustion from exercise or the sheer boredom of rest what finally brought sleep? It's hard to say definitively. The Victorian dilemma over exercise versus rest for insomnia underscores the era's confused but earnest attempts to understand and treat a complex problem. Should you push your body to the limit or protect it from any effort? The contradictory advice left many insomniacs navigating a confusing landscape of potential cures, hoping that one of these opposing strategies would finally unlock the door to restful slumber. And if tiring yourself out or resting completely didn't work, what other physical interventions were left? Perhaps something a little more herbal? So, you've tried pushing your body to the brink of exhaustion, or perhaps the opposite, lying perfectly still in a rigid rest cure, hoping that sheer inactivity would coax slumber back. Neither worked. The Victorian mind, buzzing like a trapped fly against the windowpane, remained stubbornly alert. If physical exertion and enforced stillness fail, and the mechanical contraptions are too noisy or uncomfortable, and opium feels too risky, where do you turn? The garden, the fields, the woods, the natural world, offering a seemingly endless pharmacy of plant-based possibilities. Beyond the much-hyped lettuce opium, Victorians explored a vast and often bewildering array of herbal brews and potions, hoping to find the gentle, natural key to unlock the gates of sleep. Herbal medicine had, of course, been the primary form of treatment for centuries, if not millennia. While conventional medicine was rapidly advancing in the Victorian era, popular trust in traditional remedies remained strong. For something as common and frustrating as sleeplessness, turning to plants felt intuitive, safe, and accessible. You could consult a local herbalist, buy dried herbs from the apothecary, or even gather them yourself if you knew what you were looking for. The landscape of Victorian herbal sleep aids was incredibly diverse, ranging from genuinely effective, albeit mild, sedatives to utterly useless, and sometimes even harmful, concoctions. One of the most popular and widely used herbs for nervous complaints and insomnia was valerian, Valeriana officinalis. Its root has a distinctive, rather unpleasant smell, often compared to sweaty socks or old cheese, but it was highly regarded for its calming properties. Victorians would prepare valerian root as a tea, a tincture, extracting the compounds in alcohol, or even incorporate it into pills. The belief was that valerian acted directly on the nerves, soothing excitation and promoting relaxation. Modern science actually confirms that valerian contains compounds that can affect GABA receptors in the brain, similar to some pharmaceutical sedatives, although its effects are generally much milder, and the research on its efficacy for insomnia is still a bit mixed. So, while it wasn't just pure wishful thinking, the strength and reliability varied wildly depending on the preparation and the quality of the herb. Imagine trying to drift off to sleep while your bedroom smells faintly of gym socks, all in the name of calming your nerves. Pleasant dreams. Another common herbal remedy was hops, Humulus lupulus, the same plant used to bitter beer. Hops contain sedative compounds, and Victorians used them in various ways to promote sleep. You might drink hop tea, take a hop tincture, or, perhaps most famously, fill a pillow with dried hops and rest your head upon it. The aroma of hops, it was believed, had a soothing effect that could induce drowsiness. Imagine sinking into a pillow that smells faintly of a pub floor. Perhaps not the most luxurious sleep environment, but if it worked, who were you to complain? This hot pillow idea persists even today, a testament to the lasting appeal of simple, aromatic sleep aids. Beyond these relatively well-known herbs, the Victorian pharmacopoeia for sleep included a vast assortment of other botanicals. Skullcap, passionflower, chamomile, yes, good old chamomile was around, and even weird combinations of seemingly unrelated plants were brewed, steeped, and mixed into potions. Some remedies focused on settling the stomach, believing that indigestion was the root cause of wakefulness. Others aimed to cleanse the blood, or balance the humors, concepts inherited from older medical traditions. The sheer variety of plants used reflects a trial-and-error approach, combined with folk wisdom passed down through generations and the latest, often speculative, theories about plant chemistry. A mainstream historical fact here is that the Victorian era was a period of intense interest in botany and plant chemistry. As scientists began to identify active compounds in plants, like morphine from opium, or quinine from cinchona bark, there was a widespread belief that every plant held potential medicinal properties waiting to be discovered. This fueled the search for new herbal remedies and lent an air of scientific legitimacy to traditional plant-based cures, even if the understanding of how they worked was still rudimentary. Pharmacists and chemists actively studied and catalogued medicinal plants, contributing to both legitimate drug discovery and the proliferation of less tested herbal preparations. A quirky tidbit involves some of the more unusual herbal combinations or preparations recommended. One fascinating example is the use of extracts from the cannabis plant, Cannabis indica, though it wasn't as widely discussed for simple insomnia as opium was. It was sometimes prescribed by physicians, usually in tincture form, for its sedative and pain-relieving properties, often under the name Indian hemp. While not as common as laudanum, its presence in some medical texts as a treatment for sleeplessness adds another layer to the era's exploration of plant-based sedatives. Imagine your doctor prescribing you a cannabis tincture before bed, a very different kind of nightcap than the port we discussed earlier. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of herbal remedies for insomnia in the Victorian era was genuinely effective due to the pharmacological properties of the plants, or if the perceived benefits were primarily due to the placebo effect, the calming ritual of preparing and consuming a warm drink, or simply the passage of time and the natural resolution of temporary sleeplessness. While some herbs like valerian and hops do have mild sedative effects, the potency and consistency of Victorian preparations were highly variable, and many of the recommended plants had little to no scientifically proven effect on sleep. Were people actually sleeping better, or did they just feel better because they were actively doing something to address their problem? The preparation methods were as varied as the herbs themselves. Teas were common, simply steeping the dried plant material in hot water. Tinctures, made by soaking herbs in alcohol, were popular because they were more concentrated and easier to store. Pills and powders were also made, sometimes mixing multiple herbs into a single dose. For external use, poultices or compresses soaked in herbal infusions might be applied to the head or feet, again aiming to influence blood flow or soothe nerves through the skin. You could have your insomnia cure hot, cold, liquid, solid, internal, or external, truly a buffet of botanical options. The appeal of these herbal remedies lay in their perceived naturalness and safety compared to the more powerful pharmaceutical options like opium. They offered a middle ground between the often uncomfortable physical therapies and the risky chemical sedatives. For many Victorians, brewing a pot of herbal tea or filling a hot pillow felt like a gentle, wholesome way to invite sleep, a return to simpler, perhaps more trustworthy, methods in a rapidly modernizing world. Even if their efficacy was debatable by modern standards, they provided hope and a sense of agency in the frustrating battle against sleeplessness. You might not get the guaranteed knockout punch of opium, but you also avoided the significant risks. You were trying to persuade your body and mind to sleep with a whisper of nature, rather than bludgeoning it into submission. And if the gentle whispers of plants didn't work, what other subtle, non-physical forces could be brought to bear? Perhaps something in the very air around you? So, you've tried brewing your way to slumber with valerian root and hop pillows, hoping that the gentle power of plants would finally lull you into unconsciousness. But your restless mind persists, unaffected by the smell of old socks or pub floors. If chemical remedies, physical manipulations, mental discipline, and even the botanical world have failed, maybe the answer isn't inside you, or on you, or what you do, but simply in the very air you breathe? The Victorians certainly believed that the atmosphere around you played a crucial role in health, and especially in the delicate balance required for sleep. In an era grappling with the rapid growth of cities, industrial pollution, and cramped living conditions, the quality of air became a major concern. The prevailing miasma theory, which held that diseases were caused by noxious vapors or bad air, rising from decaying organic matter, profoundly influenced how people thought about their environment. While this theory was eventually superseded by germ theory, the obsession with fresh air and ventilation as keys to health persisted. And if bad air could make you sick, surely good, pure air could help you sleep? Sleeplessness, seen as a symptom of nervous debility and a system out of balance, was often blamed on breathing stale, impure air. Imagine a typical Victorian bedroom, perhaps small, sealed against drafts, a common fear, despite the emphasis on fresh air, lit by gaslight that consumed oxygen and produced fumes, and potentially filled with the lingering sense of coal smoke, dampness, or simply too many people breathing the same space. Victorians believed this kind of environment was actively detrimental to sleep, clogging the system and irritating the nerves. You were essentially trying to sleep in a box of used air, and your body was understandably protesting. The solution, according to this line of thinking, was simple: ventilation, and lots of it. The ideal sleeping environment was one filled with crisp, clean, circulating air. This led to a widespread emphasis on opening windows, even in cold or damp weather. You might be advised to sleep with your window wide open, no matter the season, bundled under layers of blankets, enduring the chill, and potentially the noise and smells of the street below, for the sake of pure air. The logic was that the constant flow of fresh air would sweep away the noxious vapors, revitalize the blood, calm the nerves, and allow sleep to descend naturally. It was a bracing approach to bedtime, trading warmth and quiet for the supposed life-giving properties of the night air. For those living in the countryside, this might have been genuinely beneficial. For those in smog-filled industrial cities, perhaps less so. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep while inhaling the fumes from a nearby factory chimney. You might get ventilation, but you weren't exactly breathing mountain air. Beyond just opening windows, Victorians explored various methods of improving indoor air quality for sleep. Some advocated for specific bedroom designs that promoted natural airflow. Others experimented with rudimentary ventilation systems, sometimes involving vents near the ceiling or floor designed to draw stale air out and pull fresh air in. There was a general distrust of stuffy, overheated rooms. A cool, well-ventilated space was considered far more conducive to rest. You were encouraged to air out your bedroom thoroughly during the day, letting the sunlight, another perceived health booster, and fresh air circulate before closing it up, or partially closing it up, depending on your doctor's advice for the night. The materials within the bedroom were also considered. Heavy curtains, thick carpets, and excessive clutter were sometimes frowned upon, as they were thought to trap dust and bad air. Lighter, washable fabrics and simpler furnishings were preferred in some health-conscious circles, aiming for an environment that felt clean, airy, and free from anything that might harbor impurities or impede the flow of healthy air. Remember the earlier mention of choosing wallpaper colors? That wasn't just about visual stimulation. Some believed certain materials or paints could emit vapors that were either soothing or irritating to the nerves, further influencing sleep. A mainstream historical fact here is that the Victorian era saw significant public health reforms driven by the understanding that environment impacted health. Public health acts were passed, focusing on sanitation, clean water, and indeed, ventilation in buildings, including homes, schools, and workplaces. While the miasma theory was the initial driver, the practical outcome was a greater awareness of and attempts to improve air quality, which naturally extended to advice on creating a healthy sleeping environment. The emphasis on ventilation wasn't just a personal quirk, it was part of a broader societal movement towards improving urban health. A quirky tidbit involves the belief that certain plants placed in the bedroom could improve air quality and aid sleep. While we now know that plants consume oxygen at night, albeit in small amounts, some Victorians believed that plants emitted beneficial substances or simply made the air feel fresher. Keeping potted plants in the bedroom, despite concerns about dampness or attracting insects, was sometimes recommended for its supposed positive effect on the sleeping atmosphere. Imagine your bedroom becoming a mini greenhouse in the quest for sleep, hoping that a fern or a potted palm would work its botanical magic on your restless nerves. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with ventilation and fresh air had a significant direct impact on curing insomnia, or if its benefits were primarily indirect, perhaps by improving overall health, reducing exposure to actual pollutants, like gas fumes, or simply providing a calming ritual and a sense of taking control of one's environment. While good ventilation and a comfortable room temperature are certainly recommended for sleep today, the extreme measures sometimes advocated by Victorians, like sleeping with windows wide open in freezing temperatures, likely had mixed results and could even lead to illness, further disrupting sleep. Was the air truly curing them, or were they simply benefiting from a slightly less stuffy room and the powerful placebo effect of adhering to a popular health trend? The focus on atmospheric sleep solutions highlights the holistic, if sometimes misguided, approach Victorians took to health. They didn't just see insomnia as a problem of the brain or the nerves in isolation, but as something influenced by the entire environment, right down to the invisible air you breathed. It was a hopeful attempt to create a physical space that would nurture restful sleep, believing that a clean, well-ventilated bedroom was a prerequisite for a calm and quiet mind. You've tried changing yourself, now you're trying to change the very air around you, hoping that the right atmosphere will finally carry you off to dreamland. But what if the problem wasn't in the air, or your diet, or your nerves, or your willpower, but in something you bought off a shelf, promising a miracle cure? So, you've tried airing out your room like a human wind tunnel, hoping that fresh, pure air would sweep away your sleeplessness. You've experimented with temperature, humidity, and even strategically placed houseplants, all in the pursuit of the perfect atmospheric conditions for sleep. But the air, it seems, is only part of the puzzle. The Victorian insomniac, desperate for a solution, didn't just rely on doctors or old folk remedies. They also turned to the burgeoning marketplace, a wild and unregulated frontier where bottled promises and miracle cures lined the shelves. Welcome to the world of Victorian patent medicines, a free-for-all of commercial sleep cures. The Victorian era was the golden age of patent medicines. These were proprietary compounds, often with secret formulas, sold directly to the public without prescription or oversight. They weren't patented in the modern sense of protecting the formula, but rather the name and branding, allowing manufacturers to market them aggressively with often outrageous claims. If you had an ailment, any ailment, from a cough to consumption, from headaches to female complaints, or yes, from indigestion to insomnia, there was a patent medicine waiting to fix you. And for the widespread problem of sleeplessness, the market was absolutely flooded with bottled relief. Imagine walking into a chemist's shop, or even just browsing the pages of a newspaper or magazine. Advertisements screamed out from every corner, promising guaranteed cures for your sleepless nights. Dr. Johnson's soothing syrup, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. A particularly infamous one, often given to teething babies, which tells you something. Bonington's Irish Moss, Chlorodyne, Dalby's Carminative. The names often sounded wholesome, traditional, or vaguely scientific, but the contents were frequently anything but. These were the ready-made answers to a problem many found too embarrassing or too expensive to take to a formal doctor. You could simply buy a bottle, follow the instructions, which were often vague, and hope for the best. The appeal was obvious: convenience, accessibility, and the promise of a quick fix. Why bother with complicated hydrotherapy regimens or uncomfortable mechanical devices when a spoonful of a magic potion could whisk you away to dreamland? These medicines tapped into the public's growing trust in bottled remedies and their desperation for relief. They were sold everywhere, not just in pharmacies, but in general stores, market stalls, and even through traveling salesmen. Their labels often featured ornate designs, testimonials from satisfied customers, some real, many fabricated, and glowing descriptions of their supposed benefits. You were buying hope in a bottle, often literally. But what was actually in these sleep cures? Ah, that's where things get murky, unregulated, and often dangerous. While some contained relatively harmless ingredients like herbs, often in ineffective quantities, or alcohol, a shocking number relied on powerful, addictive, and potentially lethal substances, often without declaring them on the label. The most common active ingredient in Victorian sleep remedies was, you guessed it, opium, usually in the form of laudanum or morphine. Remember our discussion about opium's prevalence? Patent medicines were one of the primary ways people consumed it, often unknowingly. A soothing syrup for a restless child might contain enough morphine to knock out an adult, or at least make them dangerously drowsy. An insomnia cure for an adult could be little more than flavored laudanum. Alcohol was another ubiquitous ingredient, serving as a solvent, a preservative, and a sedative in its own right. Many tonics and elixirs were essentially alcoholic beverages with a few herbs or drugs thrown in. Some contained significant amounts of alcohol, far more than a modest nightcap. You weren't just buying medicine, you were often buying a potent, often sugary, alcoholic drink marketed as a health tonic. Beyond opium and alcohol, other powerful drugs found their way into these sleep potions. Chloral hydrate, a potent sedative and hypnotic, knockout drops, was sometimes used, as were bromides, like potassium bromide, which have sedative properties but can be toxic in large doses or with prolonged use. Even cannabis extracts occasionally appeared, though less frequently than opiates. The formulas were often inconsistent, the dosages unclear, and the potential for accidental overdose, or the development of severe addiction was enormous. Imagine trying to figure out how much of this mystery brew was enough to make you sleep but not enough to make you stop breathing permanently. It was a dangerous game of pharmaceutical roulette. The dangers went beyond just addiction and overdose. By masking symptoms with powerful sedatives, these patent medicines prevented people from seeking proper medical diagnosis and treatment for underlying conditions that might be causing their insomnia, such as pain, anxiety disorders, depression, or physical illnesses. You might get a night's sleep, but you weren't getting better. You were just postponing dealing with the real problem, while potentially creating a new one in the form of drug dependency. A mainstream historical fact here is that the lack of regulation surrounding patent medicines was a major public health crisis in the late Victorian and Edwardian eras. Investigative journalists and medical reformers campaigned tirelessly against the deceptive advertising, secret formulas, and dangerous ingredients in these products. Publications like Collier's Weekly in the US and campaigns by the British Medical Association exposed the fraudulent nature of many patent medicines, highlighting the high levels of alcohol, opium, and other drugs they contained and the harm they caused. This public outcry eventually contributed to the passage of early drug and food safety laws in the early 20th century, though the fight was long and hard against powerful manufacturing lobbies. A quirky tidbit from this era involves the sheer creativity of the advertising and the often bizarre claims made. One patent medicine for nervous complaints and insomnia called Dr. Williams' Pink Pills for Pale People, which were mostly iron sulfate, good for anemia but not much else, was marketed with elaborate, often sensational, stories of miraculous cures, including claims that they restored vitality and cured sleeplessness by enriching the blood. You weren't just buying a pill, you were buying into a narrative of transformation and recovery, all delivered in a pink pill that probably didn't do much for your sleep but might have made you slightly less anemic if you were indeed pale. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of patent medicines for insomnia contributed significantly to the perceived insomnia epidemic by fostering dependence and masking symptoms, or if they simply met an existing demand for accessible, albeit often ineffective or dangerous, remedies in a time before modern medicine offered reliable alternatives. Were they genuinely making the problem worse, or were they a symptom of an already widespread issue, offering temporary solace to a suffering population? It's a complex picture, blending genuine desperation with cynical exploitation. The experience of relying on these patent medicines must have been a roller coaster. Some nights, a dose might actually knock you out, thanks, opium. Other nights, it might do nothing, or leave you feeling groggy and unwell. The inconsistency, the hidden ingredients, and the growing awareness of their dangers added another layer of anxiety to the already stressful experience of sleeplessness. You were trying to cure your problem, but you were also taking a gamble with your health, relying on the promises of manufacturers who were far more interested in your money than your well-being. It was a stark illustration of caveat emptor in the world of Victorian health. And while these bottled cures offered a quick fix, many Victorians believed that the root of their sleeplessness lay not in a bottle, but in a deeper, more complex problem, the pervasive anxiety and nervous strain of modern life, embodied by the fashionable diagnosis of neurasthenia. So, you've navigated the chaotic, often dangerous, world of Victorian patent medicines, hoping that a mystery potion from a chemist's shelf would finally grant you respite from sleeplessness. Perhaps it worked for a night or two, thanks to the hidden opium, but then the grogginess, or the growing need for more, made you realize that bottled oblivion wasn't a sustainable solution. If the external remedies, the physical interventions, the mental exercises, and the chemical concoctions all fell short, where did the Victorian mind turn next? Often, it landed squarely on the concept that underpinned so much of the era's anxieties about health and modern life: the nerves. The Victorian era was obsessed with nerves. Not just the biological structures, but nerves as a cultural concept, a catch-all explanation for a host of physical and psychological woes. Life was changing at a dizzying pace: industrialization, urbanization, faster communication, increased social pressures, a constant influx of information, or at least, faster than before. For many, this felt like a relentless assault on the nervous system, a delicate network easily overloaded and frayed by the demands of the modern world. Insomnia wasn't just a sleep disorder. It was frequently interpreted as a primary symptom of this pervasive nervousness, a sign that your system was simply breaking down under the strain. This cultural anxiety coalesced into a fashionable and widely diagnosed condition known as neurasthenia. Coined in 1869 by American neurologist George Miller Beard, neurasthenia, or nervous exhaustion, became the quintessential Victorian ailment, particularly among the educated middle and upper classes. It was a sprawling, ill-defined syndrome encompassing symptoms like fatigue, anxiety, headache, irritability, digestive problems, and crucially, chronic insomnia. If you were a sensitive, intellectual, or highly ambitious Victorian struggling with sleeplessness, you were very likely diagnosed with neurasthenia. It was the medical equivalent of saying, "You're just stressed out by everything, aren't you?" but with a much more scientific-sounding name. The prevailing theory was that the nervous system possessed a finite amount of energy. The demands of modern life, intellectual work, emotional stress, social obligations, even the sheer speed and noise of urban environments, depleted this energy, leaving the nerves in a state of exhaustion or overexcitation, unable to function properly. Sleeplessness was seen as a direct consequence of this nervous depletion or irritation. Your brain, depleted yet somehow still buzzing, simply couldn't find the off switch. It was like a battery that was almost dead but kept trying to run a million apps at once. Treating insomnia in this context meant treating the underlying neurasthenia, which often involved a combination of approaches aimed at restoring nervous energy and calming the system. This is where many of the remedies we've discussed fit in: the rest cures, to conserve energy; the hydrotherapy, to stimulate or soothe; the dietary changes, to nourish; and even the mechanical devices and electrotherapy, to manipulate the nervous flow. The goal wasn't just to induce sleep, it was to rebuild the shattered nervous system that insomnia was a symptom of. The psychological aspect of this was significant. If your nerves were depleted, you were often advised to avoid anything stimulating: exciting novels, passionate arguments, late-night socializing, excessive intellectual work, or anything that taxed the emotions. You were encouraged to cultivate a calm, measured approach to life, to avoid worry, and to live within your nervous means. This put immense pressure on individuals, especially women, who were often seen as particularly susceptible to nervous complaints due to their supposedly more fragile constitutions and the emotional demands placed upon them by society. A woman struggling with insomnia and diagnosed with neurasthenia might be told she was simply too sensitive, too emotional, or trying to do too much, reinforcing restrictive social norms. It sounds a bit like being told your car won't start because you care too much about traffic. Self-help literature on managing nerves and neurasthenia was abundant, offering strategies for conserving nervous energy, avoiding stress, and cultivating mental tranquility. These books often blurred the lines between medical advice, moral instruction, and lifestyle coaching. You weren't just learning how to sleep, you were learning how to be a less nervously exhausted Victorian. This included advice on everything from diet and exercise, remember that conflicting advice, to managing your social calendar and even choosing your friends wisely to avoid nervous strain. A mainstream historical fact about neurasthenia is that it was a genuinely accepted medical diagnosis throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, included in medical textbooks and treated by leading physicians. While the specific theories about nervous energy depletion are no longer accepted, the concept of a stress-related syndrome causing physical and mental symptoms, including fatigue and sleep problems, has echoes in modern diagnoses like chronic fatigue syndrome or burnout, though neurasthenia was far broader and less clearly defined. A quirky tidbit involves the specific activities deemed particularly damaging to the nerves. Reading too many novels, especially sensational ones, excessive letter writing, particularly emotional letters, and even attending too many parties were sometimes listed as activities that could dangerously deplete nervous energy and trigger symptoms like insomnia. Imagine being told your sleeplessness is because you read too much fiction. The horror! Historians still argue whether neurasthenia was a distinct medical condition unique to the stresses of the Victorian era, primarily a cultural construct that provided a framework for understanding the anxieties of a rapidly changing society, or simply a catch-all term for a variety of undiagnosed physical and mental illnesses, like depression, anxiety disorders, or thyroid problems, that modern medicine can now differentiate. Was it a real epidemic of nervous exhaustion, or was it a fashionable label applied to the widespread discomfort and distress caused by modernization? It's likely a complex mix of all these factors. The connection between nerves, neurasthenia, and insomnia in the Victorian era highlights how deeply sleep problems were intertwined with the broader anxieties about progress, health, and the human capacity to adapt to a new, faster world. Insomnia wasn't just a physical inconvenience. It was seen as a signal that the very core of your being, your delicate nervous system, was struggling to cope. This perspective shaped the search for cures, leading Victorians to explore remedies that aimed not just at inducing sleep, but at restoring the fundamental balance of a system believed to be on the brink of collapse. You weren't just battling sleeplessness, you were battling the perceived price of modernity itself. And in this complex landscape of causes and cures, who did you trust? The formal medical establishment, with its evolving theories and sometimes harsh treatments, or the age-old wisdom passed down through generations? So, you've battled your nerves, tried to wrangle your thoughts, and perhaps even subjected yourself to the rigors of an exercise regime or a rest cure, hoping to restore that elusive nervous balance and finally achieve sleep. But in this complex landscape of causes and cures, the Victorian insomniac faced another crucial choice. Who did you listen to? The learned physician, with his evolving, and sometimes contradictory, scientific theories and often harsh interventions, or the grandmotherly wisdom, the advice passed down through generations, found in dusty almanacs and whispered over kitchen tables? This was the fundamental tension between formal medical prescriptions and the vast realm of popular home remedies and folk wisdom. On one side stood the doctor. The Victorian medical profession was rapidly professionalizing, armed with new knowledge, though still limited by modern standards, diagnostic tools, and an increasing array of potent drugs and procedures. If you consulted a physician for your insomnia, you might be subjected to a thorough examination, questions about your lifestyle, diet, and mental state, and then presented with a treatment plan that could involve anything from a prescription for laudanum, a powerful, but readily available tool in their arsenal, to recommendations for hydrotherapy at a specialized clinic. Or perhaps a stern recommendation for a rest cure if your nerves were deemed sufficiently shattered. Doctors often relied on the prevailing scientific theories of the day, the idea of nervous exhaustion, the importance of digestion, the potential of electricity, and their treatments reflected these beliefs. They offered authority, a sense of being in expert hands, and access to treatments that weren't always available to the layperson, like high-dose sedatives or institutional care. You were placing your trust in science, or at least, the best understanding of science available at the time, hoping their learned approach would unravel the mystery of your sleepless nights. However, consulting a doctor wasn't always accessible or desirable. It could be expensive, especially for the working classes. Doctors could be intimidating, their treatments uncomfortable or even painful, remember the electrical zaps. And their advice could sometimes feel out of touch with daily life. This is where folk wisdom and home remedies stepped in, offering an alternative, often gentler, and more accessible path to sleep. This wasn't codified medicine, it was practical advice rooted in tradition, observation, and often, sheer desperation. Home remedies for insomnia were incredibly diverse, reflecting regional variations, family traditions, and what was readily available. They often focused on simple, natural ingredients and rituals. Think of the warm milk, the herbal teas, beyond just valerian and hops. There were countless local blends, specific foods believed to be calming, like lettuce, yes, but also things like warm gruel or specific fruits, or simple environmental adjustments like ensuring a dark room or using extra blankets. These remedies were often passed down from mother to daughter, shared among neighbors, or found in popular publications like women's magazines or domestic manuals, which offered advice on everything from cooking and cleaning to managing household health. You weren't getting a formal diagnosis of neurasthenia, you were being told, "Try this tea my grandmother swore by," or "Make sure you air out your room properly, dear." It was a more personal, less intimidating approach, often infused with comfort and familiarity. Imagine your doctor telling you to sleep in a wet sheet pack versus your aunt suggesting a cup of chamomile tea with honey. You can see the appeal of the latter. The contrast wasn't just in the methods, but in the underlying philosophy. Formal medicine, particularly as the century progressed, increasingly sought specific causes and applied targeted interventions, sometimes quite aggressive ones. Folk wisdom, while also seeking relief, often viewed health more holistically, emphasizing balance, routine, and the gentle power of nature and tradition. Doctors might prescribe potent drugs or recommend rigorous regimens. Folk wisdom might suggest a warm foot bath, a change of diet, or a specific prayer before bed. One approached insomnia as a potentially serious pathological condition requiring expert intervention. The other often saw it as an imbalance, a temporary affliction that could be soothed by simple, time-tested means. It's like comparing a modern hospital stay for a complex illness to being nursed back to health at home with chicken soup and bed rest. Many Victorians likely navigated both worlds, perhaps trying home remedies first before consulting a doctor, or using folk remedies to supplement or mitigate the harsher effects of medical treatments. Cost was a significant factor. Home remedies were often cheap or free, while medical consultations and prescriptions could be costly. Trust also played a role. Some people might have more faith in the authority of a doctor, while others trusted the familiar wisdom of their community or family more. The patent medicine boom we discussed earlier further complicated this landscape, offering seemingly medical solutions that were actually unregulated commercial products, blurring the lines between formal medicine, quackery, and accessible home treatment. You could buy a bottle that looked like medicine but was essentially folk wisdom in a bottle, often with added drugs. A mainstream historical fact here is that the divide between formal medicine and folk remedies was particularly pronounced in the Victorian era due to the rapid advancements and professionalization of medicine. Doctors were increasingly educated in scientific principles, as understood then, and sought to distance themselves from traditional healers and quack practitioners. However, public trust in formal medicine was not absolute, and many people continued to rely on traditional practices and self-treatment, creating a dynamic interplay between these different approaches to health and illness. A quirky tidbit from this period involves the belief in sympathetic magic or ritualistic cures found in some folk traditions. For example, some remedies involved burying certain objects, tying knots in specific ways, or performing particular actions at certain times of the moon, all aimed at symbolically binding or transferring, the sleeplessness away from the individual. While certainly not endorsed by physicians, these practices persisted in some communities, highlighting the blend of practical observation, superstition, and ritual that constituted folk wisdom. Imagine trying to explain to your doctor that you're burying a sock in the garden to cure your insomnia. Historians still argue whether the persistence and popularity of folk remedies for insomnia reflected a failure of formal medicine to adequately address the problem, or if they simply served different needs, providing comfort, a sense of control, and accessible alternatives in a time when medical care was less advanced and less universally available. Were people sticking to home remedies because they worked, or because they were the only option, or because they offered solace even if they didn't offer a cure? It's a complex question with no single answer. Ultimately, the Victorian Insomniac was presented with a confusing array of potential solutions, drawing from the evolving theories of science, the enduring practices of tradition, and the booming promises of the marketplace. You could choose the path of the doctor, with its potential for powerful drugs and rigorous treatments, or the path of folk wisdom, with its gentle teas and comforting rituals. Or, most likely, you mixed and matched, trying a bit of everything, hoping that somewhere in this vast, contradictory landscape of cures, you would find the one thing that would finally grant you the gift of sleep. You were your own medical experiment, navigating a world where the difference between doctor's orders and grandma's advice could be as stark as a wet sheet pack versus a hot pillow. And as these various remedies rose and fell in popularity, some ideas faded into history, others persisted, and a few even laid the groundwork for how we think about sleep today. So, you've navigated the conflicting advice of doctors and the comforting whispers of folk wisdom, tried everything from opium to onions, from wet sheets to electrical zaps, all in the desperate, uniquely Victorian quest for sleep. You've peered into the dimly lit bedrooms, the bustling chemists, the hydrotherapy clinics, and the self-help manuals of an era convinced it was facing an unprecedented epidemic of sleeplessness, brought on by the relentless march of modernity and the fraying of delicate nerves. But now, as the gaslight of the Victorian age flickers out and we drift back towards our own time, what remains of this peculiar landscape of sleep cures? Which ideas were simply strange historical curiosities, which held a grain of truth, and how does their frantic search compare to our modern understanding and our own, often equally peculiar, struggles with sleep? Many of the remedies we've explored have, thankfully, faded into the dusty archives of medical history. The mechanical rocking beds and head-patting machines, for instance, while fascinating examples of Victorian ingenuity, proved to be more novelty than cure. You won't find a doctor today prescribing a session with a vibratory chair or recommending you strap yourself into a device that gently thumps your skull. The specific form of electrotherapy they use for insomnia, based on rudimentary understanding of brain function, has also been discarded, replaced by vastly more sophisticated and targeted forms of neuromodulation for specific conditions, none of which resemble the general zapping of the Victorian era for simple sleeplessness. And while hydrotherapy in the form of warm baths is still a popular relaxation technique, the extreme cold plunges and wet sheet packs as primary insomnia cures are no longer standard medical practice. The sheer discomfort and potential dangers outweighed their questionable efficacy. Imagine telling your sleep therapist you're going to try wrapping yourself in a cold, wet sheet tonight. They'd probably recommend a different approach. Other Victorian ideas, however, weren't entirely off the mark, even if their understanding of why they worked was flawed. The emphasis on diet, for instance, while leading to some bizarre recommendations like raw onions or calf's foot jelly, contained the germ of truth that what and when you eat can influence sleep. Modern sleep hygiene certainly advises avoiding heavy meals, caffeine, and alcohol close to bedtime, echoing the Victorian concern with digestion and stimulants, albeit with a much more refined understanding. And while lettuce opium didn't live up to its name, the broader idea of using plant-based remedies persists. Chamomile tea is still a go-to for many seeking relaxation, and research continues into the mild sedative properties of herbs like valerian and passion flower, validating the Victorian interest in natural, botanical sleep aids, even if their preparations were inconsistent and their expectations often too high. The Victorian obsession with fresh air and ventilation also resonates today. While we've moved beyond miasma theory, creating a cool, well-ventilated bedroom environment is a cornerstone of modern sleep hygiene. We understand that temperature and air quality significantly impact sleep comfort and continuity. So, while sleeping with the window wide open in a blizzard might have been extreme, the underlying principle of not sleeping in a stuffy, overheated room was sound. Perhaps most significantly, the Victorian focus on nerves, neurasthenia, and the psychological toll of modern life laid crucial groundwork for understanding the link between stress, anxiety, and insomnia. While neurasthenia as a distinct diagnosis faded, the core idea that mental and emotional states profoundly impact sleep is central to modern sleep science. Contemporary approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI, directly address the racing thoughts, worries, and maladaptive beliefs about sleep that plagued Victorians and continue to plague us. Their early attempts at willpower and mind control, like paradoxical intention or visualization, find echoes in CBTI techniques, albeit within a more structured, evidence-based framework. You were trying to wrestle your mind into submission back then. Now, you're learning techniques to gently guide it towards relaxation. The goal is similar, the method hopefully less frustrating. The conflicting advice on exercise versus rest also reflects a debate that continues today, though with more nuance. We know that regular exercise promotes better sleep, but strenuous activity too close to bedtime can be disruptive. The Victorian struggle highlights the difficulty in finding that balance. Was the problem exhaustion or overstimulation? Modern advice emphasizes timing and moderation. And while the extreme rest cures are widely criticized today for their potential psychological harm and lack of clear efficacy, the idea that periods of rest and reduced stress are necessary for recovery from chronic fatigue and burnout, conditions that bear some resemblance to neurasthenia, still holds sway in some therapeutic contexts, though never to the extent of enforced, isolated bed rest. The legacy of Victorian patent medicine serves as a powerful cautionary tale. The dangers of unregulated cures containing hidden, addictive substances led directly to the development of food and drug safety laws in the early 20th century. We now have a much better understanding of the risks of sedatives and hypnotics, the potential for dependence, and the importance of professional medical guidance for persistent sleep problems. The Victorian era's free-for-all in the marketplace starkly illustrates why that regulation was desperately needed. You might still find questionable supplements online today, but the blatant, widespread sale of opium-laced syrups without warning is, thankfully, a relic of the past. A mainstream historical fact tying this all together is that the Victorian era's extensive documentation and public discourse surrounding insomnia, coupled with the sheer variety of attempted cures, provided valuable data and impetus for later scientific and medical research into sleep. While many of their theories were wrong and their remedies ineffective or dangerous, their very recognition of insomnia as a significant problem, and their earnest, if often misguided, attempts to solve it, highlighted the need for a deeper understanding of sleep physiology and psychology, paving the way for the development of modern sleep medicine as a distinct field. A quirky tidbit that bridges the gap between their era and ours is the sheer persistence of some sleep myths and folk remedies. Despite centuries of scientific progress, you can still find people recommending counting sheep, avoiding cheese before bed, another old belief, or swearing by specific herbal concoctions with little scientific backing. It seems the human desire for simple, accessible solutions to the frustrating problem of sleeplessness transcends the ages, a ghostly echo of the Victorian chemist's shelf or the whispered family recipe. Historians still argue whether the Victorian insomnia epidemic was truly a unique crisis of its time, or if it was primarily a consequence of increased awareness, changing social norms around sleep duration, and the medicalization of natural sleep variations. Was the problem itself worse, or were they just talking about it more and trying stranger things to fix it? It's hard to say definitively, but their struggle feels remarkably familiar. We too live in a rapidly changing, often stressful world, bombarded by information and stimulation, and many of us still battle restless nights. We have different tools, sleep apps, advanced pharmaceuticals, sophisticated therapies, but the fundamental challenge of quieting a buzzing mind and finding consistent, restorative sleep remains. As we leave the peculiar world of Victorian insomnia cures behind, we can see that their desperate search wasn't just about finding sleep. It was about trying to find balance and peace in a world that felt increasingly out of control. Their array of remedies, from the logical to the laughable, the harmless to the horrifying, reflects a society grappling with the price of progress and the enduring mystery of the sleeping mind. They threw everything they had at the problem, hoping something, anything, would work. And while most of their peculiar cures have been relegated to historical footnotes, their struggle reminds us that the quest for a good night's sleep is a timeless human endeavor, one that continues, in our own peculiar ways, today. Now allow yourself to settle deeper into your own bed. Feel the weight of the blankets, the softness of the pillow beneath your head. The Victorian era, with its gaslight shadows and restless nights, is fading now, receding into the quiet corners of history. The strange contraptions, the bitter brews, the whispered remedies, they are just stories carried away on the gentle current of time. Your own room is quiet, safe, illuminated only by the soft glow of moonlight or the reassuring darkness. There are no mechanical patters here, no cold, wet sheets, no worries about frayed nerves or noxious vapors. Just you here now, breathing softly. Let the tension drain from your muscles, from your shoulders, your arms, your hands. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the mattress, heavy and relaxed. Let the thoughts that kept those Victorians awake, and perhaps linger in your own mind, simply drift away like smoke. They have no power here, in this quiet space, at this time. Just breathe slowly, deeply. In and out. The night is calm, the world is still. There is nothing left to do, nowhere left to be, but here, resting. Allow yourself to be heavy, to be still, to be at peace. Sleep is not a battle to be won, but a gentle tide waiting to carry you away. Just let go. Let go and drift, drift,